Okay, let's dive right into ceremony and talk about some of the more important aspects of the novel. One of the most important things that I'm sure you have seen has been the way it plays with time, the sequencing of time, the narrative events that occur in Teo's mind as he is struggling to recover from what is obviously what we now would call post-traumatic stress disorder. That it puts him into a kind of a discombobulated flurry of time, a kind of a blizzard of time. And you're seeing that, and as you watch, you'll see that it starts to straighten out as you move through from the first 100 pages, and as Teo begins to engage in his ceremonies. The idea of post-traumatic stress, that's something that really only was coined, that term, after the Vietnam War. But of course, throughout time, human beings, through living through war and that kind of stress and trauma of war, have had these same kinds of experiences. They've been called different things over time. You can find reference to such psychological disturbances all the way back into ancient times, but especially you'll see that in World War I, this was called shell shock, and this is when people were fighting wars in the trenches. The giant shells that they would lob over the no man's land at one another would frequently just completely shatter people's sense of self and the rest. And so you'd have people staring off into the distance with shell shock in the First World War. In the Second World War, it was referred to as battle fatigue. So that would be what Teo would be thinking about. And then in Vietnam, we started talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's something that we've been focusing on primarily as a way to think about the psychological effects of war on human beings. But the novel obviously takes us into several different times. So the events that are occurring in the beginning of the book, really this is right after, during and after and before World War I. So around that time of the mid-1930s up through the 1950s, which is when this book is taking place, after Teo has been in the hospital and back from the war. And Teo participated in what you're reading about there is the Bataan Death March. He and Rocky were on the Bataan Death March, and there's plenty of material you can look into to find out more about this. The Japanese army marched Filipino, American, I think also Australian and British, some Australian and British soldiers as well, on a super long march through the Philippines that wound up killing something like half of the people who took off on the initial march. So the novel takes up the Second World War, and as you can see, when the novel comes out, this is in the time of the First World War. I mean, of the Vietnam War. But I've set up some sites for you to look at. But Native Americans participated in war in a much larger number than general population, and so there's a lot of interesting material that you can find about that. Here's something from the Atomic Heritage Foundation and National Museum related to the Death March, the Bataan Death March, and then of course Vietnam. The Native American soldiers fought in Vietnam. So Leslie Silko is writing that book, writing this book. It comes out right after the Vietnam War, and at a time when Native Americans had started to focus on the American Indian movement, a kind of pan-Native American movement to bring together Native Americans. And some of you may be familiar with the occupation of Alcatraz in San Francisco Bay. Here's some good sites regarding that. So Alcatraz Island was occupied from 1969 to 1971, and so this would have been right before Leslie Silko's novel came out, and there was a lot of agitation in response to the Vietnam War, and that would have formed a really important central part of the way people were thinking about warfare and war at that time, especially Native American people, but just anybody in the United States thinking about war. And so the Native American movement, American Indian movement, comes right throughout the same time. So, and then also, of course, there are those two times, the World War II, and then Vietnam when the novel comes out, and then we can think about today, and what does this book mean for us today? But it also takes place in this kind of timeless, immemorial time, and that's what's happening when you read the very beginning of the novel, and you see this is another image of more modern Native American Indian movement. protests. But when there's a picture of Laguna Pueblo. That would be Mount Taylor in the back there, which becomes a very prominent part of the book. Anyway, and this is old Laguna. There's a newer Laguna that's a little bit off to the side over here. If you've ever been there, you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, the novel also takes place in this time immemorial, and these are the old stories that you're hearing that are written in kind of poetic meter throughout the rest of the novel. This is where the book begins with Tsuchinako, the Spider Woman, who she thinks about things and then become real. So that's kind of at the center of this as well. So you're thinking about, and this is Laguna. It's in central New Mexico, western central New Mexico. Here's an architectural image of the kind of buildings that people would have lived in Laguna, and they still exist there today. It's very ancient. These are really ancient structures. It's a very old place. So the history of the place lasts on to this day, and so that's another part of this book. So it's all these different times taking place, and here's the idea of Spider Woman. She's sitting in her room thinking up a good story now. I'm telling you the story she is thinking. So you're also thinking about race, identity, and culture within this novel. And I think if you look at some of these, here are some general themes that run through Ceremony, and it's so rich with different themes and different ideas. So have at it. This book really should provide you with a lot of different ways to think about time, think about American history, and to think about warfare, psychology, all sorts of questions about identity, race, and identity and culture. These are things that are so prominent today and what we talk about today. And this novel really takes us right into the heart of that.